Hi everyone, my name is Wanita and I'll be presenting on a research paper titled The Critical Role of Mental Imagery in Human Emotion, Insights from Fear-Based Imagery and Aphantasia. I personally really enjoyed reading this paper and I hope by the end of the presentation you'll find its appeal and perhaps learn something new. So firstly, I'll address the research question. The primary research question in this study was, does mental imagery function to enhance emotions and thought? The paper tries to introduce a new way to answer this question that other studies or other researchers have tried to answer before in the past. I'll be addressing that more in the next slide. Most past studies included participants giving subjective reports of emotions when they were asked to think of something with or without mental sensory simulation. For example, maybe you'd be asked to think of something scary and then they would record your physical or physiological arousal to that prompt, and then you might be asked to try not to think of anything at all. That would be a really difficult thing to do because often people who do have mental imagery can't voluntarily switch on and off sensory simulation on cue. So I guess that's one of the really major weaknesses of past studies that this study wanted to address. So now that I've spoken about what past studies aim to do, we'll take a look at what this study or how this study aimed to be different. So obviously the researchers would want to develop a study that would avoid the past weaknesses. So their aim was to test the theory by using individuals with aphantasia to record fear-based physiological responses measured with skin conductance level. I'll be breaking this down in the next slide, but basically the past weakness is that people can't voluntarily switch on or off their mental imagery. So an obvious solution would be, okay, let's use people who don't have mental imagery. Before going any further, I thought it'd be important to explain some of the key concepts that I introduced in the research aim slide, the first being mental imagery. Mental imagery involves the use of what's often referred to as the mind's eye. It is a mental representation of sensory information without direct external stimulus. For instance, when most people are asked to imagine an apple within their mind, they can literally visualize an apple in their mind. So on the other hand, people with aphantasia cannot visualize or imagine mental representations in their mind. I'm one of these people. It's really normal for me. It kind of is what it is. And then fear-based imagery in this study refers to the act of reading a frightening scenario and imagining it in your mind, so creating that mental representation. Then why use skin level conductance? So skin conductance is a measure of electrical conductivity in your skin. So when you get aroused, for example, or when the autonomic nervous system is aroused, that level will increase. So in this scenario, if you read something frightening and then you imagine that frightening stimulus, you'll have a larger physiological arousal. Now I'll talk a bit more about the hypothesis. So the researchers of this study predicted that people with aphantasia who cannot generate visual mental representations of images would exhibit less increases in skin conductance level than controls. In this study, the controls were people with just normal mental imagery or people who experienced normal imagination and could see things within their minds. So the basic, I think, to put it really simply, it's okay, we're going to measure your arousal. If a person who's got aphantasia reads something super scary, they might not have the same arousal as a person who sees mental images. And then that brings us back to the research question, which is, how do mental images affect our emotions? Do they or do they not? So if our hypothesis is that people with aphantasia will have kind of less arousal or less of that skin conductance level, then that would mean that mental images have a big impact on our emotional responses. Wide range of implications of this study. It just adds to the existing knowledge that we have about aphantasia as well as hyperphantasia, and just studies about neurodiversity and how people think and feel differently and how we all experience the world in such differing ways. So it just adds to that existing knowledge and body of work that's really coming up nowadays. And then it also informs therapeutic practices. For example, people with post-traumatic stress disorder we might understand more that they might experience flashbacks of certain incidents and have mental representations of that within their minds, and how that impacts this disorder that they're experiencing, and how we might think of interventions to counteract that. Also within education, how we teach children, for example, with aphantasia, or children who are very visual, we'd have to take more personalized teaching approaches. And the last implication I'll go over is just the use of it as an assessment tool. This would be really good. For example, you can measure someone's skin conductance level when they read a particular phrase, and if they don't respond at the arousal that we normally expect, then that might mean that that person has aphantasia. I'll talk a bit about the methodology. So there were two concurrent experiments within the study. There was the imagery experiment and the perception experiment, and then the researchers compared the two. So with the imagery experiment, this is when people were told to read certain prompts that were frightening, and then your arousal would be recorded with the skin level conductance. Whereas with the perception experiment, everyone would be shown an image of something frightening, and then your arousal level would then be measured from that. Last slide has the results of the study. So with the first one, the imagery experiment, we can clearly see that people who experience aphantasia had lower levels of skin level conductance, meaning they were less aroused when they were just reading a frightening story. Whereas people who could have those mental representations had way more arousal than they did. And then you compare that to the perception test, where everyone's just being shown scary images. Both groups seem to have similar responses to seeing something scary, but then they have different responses when it comes to when they're required to imagine something scary. The people with aphantasia obviously can't imagine, and so then the study found that mental representations actually do impact fear-based responses quite a lot in this case.